Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hello everyone, I'm Troy Moling, and thanks for joining us today on Market Journal. So happy to be back with you this week, and a special thanks to Bill Dodd for holding down the fort for me while I was away on paternity leave. We have a great show coming up for you. And beginning the broadcast, according to the latest USDA crop progress report, Nebraska growers have planted 71% of this year's corn crop, with 12% of the crop emerged. Soybeans are moving along with 47% of the crop planted at 3% emergence. And overall, 67% of the nation's corn and 42% of the nation's soybeans are planted. I was joined by Iowa State Extension economist Chad Hart earlier this week for a closer look at those numbers.
I think when you look at the numbers nationwide, yep, we know we're definitely ahead. And that, I guess I'll call it that surge, a lot of that is driven by the dry conditions that we've had. So call this the blessing of the drought, if you will, allowing us to get out in the fields, especially in the northern parts of the Corn Belt, a little bit earlier than normal. But I think the numbers also sort of hide this north-south divide that we're seeing right now in terms of planting. The idea is, yes, we are well ahead as you look in the central and northern parts of the Corn Belt. But as you start to look down south, that's when you see, delays happening there due to wet conditions. And it's sort of a tale of, okay, farmers wanting what the other farmers are getting. The guys down south would like to dry out a bit so they could catch up. Meanwhile, here us up north have been searching for moisture and hoping that it moves north here soon.
Yeah, Chad, weather, such a huge story right now. Would one general rain across the Corn Belt be enough to change the market significantly?
Well, I think it's more than one round. I think it's one of these deals of when we look at how dry our soil conditions are right now, I think the market knows that we're going to need some sustained rains over the next couple of months to really help this crop get through. Yeah, the system that just came through here provided that needed shot, here right after we got a majority of the crop planted. So that gets us going, but we know that we're going to need another good rain like that within the next week. We're going to need another one after that in a couple of weeks. And so I think it is looking for more of a change in the overall weather pattern as opposed to just one good storm changing the market's thoughts on this crop.
Okay, Chad, I also want to talk about corn because we had that 8-year high last week. I heard an analyst the other day say to go ahead and keep selling that old corn if you've got it, but he was saying that folks are maybe a little gun shy when it comes to pricing the new crop.
Well, definitely the volatility does play in, and I got to admit, I agree with that analyst that, if I'm still sitting on some old crop, now is a great time to move that crop along. At the same time, too, with the new crop, what I'm looking to do is not necessarily fully price it, but can I put in some floors underneath this market right now? Because you are seeing a sizable gap as we look at old crop versus new crop pricing. You've got, old crop pricing well into the $7 range, while when I'm looking at new crop bids, we're talking more in that $5.50 range. Futures have topped up above $6, but we're seeing some wider basis as we look out there towards harvest time. And so I think it is sort of a split here of going, yeah, I want to be fairly aggressive on the old crop side. I want to be, let's call it selectively aggressive with new crop, but probably not fully locking in that price, especially the basis at this point in time. I may be looking to put in a floor underneath futures by either using a hedge or a put option, but I'm not looking to fully price that new crop yet.
And then with soybeans, I don't really know that there's anyone out there with old crop, maybe a very small percentage, but maybe a bit more of a cap on potential losses with soybeans since the supplies are so tight, you think?
Well, there is more of a cap, but you've still got that same sort of gap, when we're looking at, nearby futures over 16, but as we look out to harvest time, floating in that $13 to $14 range, and the same thing's happening there. But you're right in that, as we're looking at, let's call it pricing moving forward, We know that that soybean market right now is just incredibly tight, especially if the usage side of the market continues to churn through beans like it has over the past, especially 10 months.
All right, and WASDE report this week. We are speaking with you right before that report comes out. What's the big story for this month's release?
So as we look at this month's report, May is always the first time when they put out that new crop projection. As you look out there, May is not a time when they typically make any adjustments on the supply side, so they tend to stick with trendline yields. They tend to stick with acreage as was put out in the March, prospective plantings report. So the supply side doesn't tend to move with the May report, but it's really looking at that demand side. Do we see them make adjustments? We went from fairly low levels of export demand as we were, coming out of the trade fights of the past few years to record high sales this year going into this next crop.
Chad, great information as always. Let's end things today with any marketing or risk management advice that you'd like to mention that we haven't talked about.
Well, I think, as we talked about a little earlier, I think the idea is, especially with new crop, one of the things I am sort of watchful on here is that if you want to think of it this way, we have taken these futures markets up to levels, as you say, we haven't seen in 7-8 years. So it does afford us some opportunities to put in some price floors. I'm not necessarily being that aggressive on to fully mark up the new crop yet, though, because we are seeing some wider basis out there as we look towards harvest time. And so, like I say, exploring those hedges or those puts to create that floor makes a lot of sense here, especially because of how volatile the market is. We just finished up classes here at Iowa State over the past week or so, and one of the things the students and I talked about in the last days of class was looking back at years where we've seen volatility like this. And one of the students brought up the year 2008, where it is oddly similar, at least on the front end of what we've seen, where we sort of started out the year in that $4 range. We've gone up here to $7-8, but if you think back to 2008, that was the year by the time we got to harvest time again, we were back down in the fours. So it shows that these markets can go up very quickly and can go down just as fast. So we want to have those price floors in place to protect ourselves against that possibility.
Next week, we'll be joined by North Dakota State's Frayne Olson. If you have a question you'd like for me to ask him, email us or get a hold of us on social media, and I'll pass your question along. Next up, with rising temperatures into the spring and summer, producers can expect to see evidence of alfalfa weevils in the state. It's recommended to regularly scout alfalfa fields this spring to avoid economic losses in hay production. Market Journal's Maddie McIntosh spoke with Nebraska Extension entomologist Jeff Bradshaw to learn more about your management options to treat this overwintering pest.
As temperatures are heating up, the pests are coming out. For alfalfa, weevils are emerging and being spotted in parts of Nebraska. This is due to the overwintering adults moving back into the fields in spring.
Typically, we start finding alfalfa weevils around this time of year, sometimes a little bit earlier, sometimes a little bit later, depending on degree days. And so we've had some fields throughout Nebraska, including the Panhandle and into Wyoming, in fact, that have seen pretty serious numbers of alfalfa weevils. Typically, if it's a cold enough winter, those eggs that are laid in the stems will die. Sometimes those eggs can survive through the winter as well. And so that dynamic can complicate management.
A weevil infestation should be paid close attention to, as they are capable of causing economic harm to the crop. To make sure you know how many you're dealing with, Jeff says to take a big sample.
Yeah, so it really depends on the stage of alfalfa. So if it was a new seeding, the damage can be a lot greater than if it's an older stand of alfalfa. If you have a heavy infestation, it can have, the canopy can have kind of a silvering or graying appearance where the leaves have started to die back from all the feeding. So sometimes it can be really conspicuous, but sometimes not so much. We recommend that you first take a sweep net and take some sweep samples, just to identify the presence, confirm the presence. The injurious stage really is the larvae, and so you want to scout for the larvae. So we recommend taking 10 random samples of alfalfa stems. So you take the stem and you bang it in a bucket, And then you can dump those larvae out and count them. And depending on that count, and again, on the length of the stems that you took on average, then you can find the threshold.
When it comes to treatment, pesticides are one option. However, producers should pay attention to the labels, as some weevils have shown a resistance in the past.
Yeah, so there's a number of labeled pesticides that are labeled for that target site, including a number of pyrethroids, as well as indoxacarb and some organophosphates as well. One of the challenges we've seen in some parts of the country is there's been resistance of those weevils, some populations developing against pyrethroids and even indoxacarb and some other classes of chemistries.
Lastly, Jeff says there is one option for producers who are on top of their game that doesn't involve pesticides.
Sometimes we see overwintering of not just the adult stage, but also the egg stage. And one of the methods for management of alfalfa weevil in the past has been to cut early. So if the adults overwinter, and just the adults, they come out and lay eggs, and our degree day models can predict when that's going to happen. If you just had overwintering adults, you could cut the alfalfa early as another control tactic instead of using an insecticide. So if you remove the host, then that's no longer a risk to the crop. But the problem is we've had some eggs overwintering as well. And so those populations hatch at a different time. And so you can have an early season and kind of a later early season population. So some nuances there, but generally speaking, right now we don't have any evidence in our area of resistance, but it's something we are keeping an eye on.
Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Maddie McIntosh.
Thanks, Maddie. For more information about the advised insecticides and other treatment methods, check out UNL's 2021 guide for weed management or contact your local extension office. Next up, we often focus on how feed prices might impact a producer's bottom line and on how feed quality may affect an animal's performance. But it's important to remember the water demands that come with raising cattle and understanding what your herd's water footprint means. UNL's Andrea Watson is an expert in ruminant nutrition and spoke with me about what we need to know in managing our cattle's water efficiency.
You know, it takes a lot of water, and we're talking 650,000 gallons maybe to produce one animal. Now you got to take into consideration that's the cow out there for an entire year grazing grass and consuming water, plus that calf then maybe getting backgrounded into the feedlot. And so yeah, it's a big number, but when we break it down relative to what's produced by each of those animals.
And percentage-wise, where does that fall if we're looking at maybe a pie chart as far as the percentages for that water use, and maybe what are some of those ideal percentages?
Yeah, so some of the data that we've pulled together, it's maybe 50% of that water is going to the cow, right? If you think about her out there for a year, and then the other 50% would go to the calf as they're backgrounded, if they are or not, or the feedlot, really depending on how many days they're in the feedlot, the efficiency, their daily gain at that point.
Where have you found that producers are using too much water or maybe not enough water?
Well, really anything we can do to improve efficiency, whether that's grazing efficiency, so better using our rangelands, or efficiency in the feedlot phase, right? Fewer days on feed with the same end carcass weight. Anything we can do on those two sides really directly impacts our water use and would reduce our water use.
And then I guess it would also, depending on what part of the state you're in, maybe different regulations, because I know that in some parts of the state you're going to have restrictions on how much water that can be used. How does that come into play?
Absolutely. So one real key thing is the type of water that we're talking about. So there's green water, blue water, and gray water. So green water is simply rainfall. And it's important to know that about 86%, so 80 to 90% of this total water footprint that we're talking about is actually just rainwater. The remainder then would be mostly blue, which is ground surface water, typically irrigation water, right? And a little bit of gray water. And so as you move east to west, your rainfall would decrease. And then also it's important to take into consideration irrigation, right? Kind of following the Platte River Valley and things, irrigation, because again, about 98% of this total water goes to grow the crops instead of actually going to the animals themselves for drinking, processing, different things. And so as you move east to west, just being really efficient with your water, because we have less of that rainwater, becomes more important.
And finally, what are some tools that farmers can use to be more efficient with their water and just overall be good stewards in the environment?
You know, it really comes back to grazing the crops, because that's where the biggest bulk of this water footprint is. It's the feeds that they're consuming, the water that was used to grow those. So the irrigation technologies that we have now, whether that's better crops that are growing on dry land to have higher yields, or the improved irrigation efficiencies, all of those things will directly impact then our water footprint for cattle production as well.
You can find more on this and other beef topics at beef.unl.edu. And speaking of beef, it's almost as if the sandhills of Nebraska were made just for raising cattle. Arthur Bowring knew that the sandhills were unique. Just before his 21st birthday, he acquired 160 acres near Merriman. Arthur raised Hereford cattle on his ranch, but in 1909, he lost his first wife and newborn son during a violent thunderstorm. In 1928, Arthur remarried Eve Forrester and later served in the Nebraska legislature. After Arthur died, Eve was appointed the first woman from Nebraska to serve in the U.S. Senate. Eve passed away in 1985 and gifted their beloved ranch to the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission, where it now serves as a working ranch and a state historical park. You can learn more about the historic Bowring Ranch in the April-May issue of Nebraska Farmer. Great story. Time now for weather with Nebraska Extension Ag Climatologist and Market Journal Chief Meteorologist Al Dutcher. Good to see you again, Al. What can you tell us about this active weather pattern that we've been seeing, and what's our forecast for the week ahead?
Well, Troy, glad to see you back. I hope the birth went well and that everything is fine at the home front. In terms of the weather, we've seen that rain that came in earlier in the week across the southern panhandle in the southwest and portions of south central and southeast Nebraska. That system basically kept the cool air in place, and as we've warmed up during the week, we started to draw our attention to the west, where we have an upper air low that's moving in, and that is going to be responsible for some stormy pattern across some of the central and southern plains as we go through this next week, and potentially some of that heavier rain moving up into the southern part of the state, although it doesn't look so great for the northern part of the state, unfortunately. But we do still see an active pattern. It's just that we're still in that late spring mode. We haven't seen the real warm air move into our region. We're going to get a taste of that this week as we go through the model. So as we look at what is going on, draw your attention to the west. This is that upper air low. It's going to slowly move through the southern stream. And so we're going to start to see pieces of energy ejecting out, just as we did on last night and, of course, on Thursday. And we've seen the thunderstorms. Again, we have that first wave that's going to be moving out low at the Texas Panhandle, bringing Gulf moisture in. Most of the heavy concentrated precipitation for today looks like it's going to be across Kansas, with some light precipitation across the Panhandle. And as we go into tomorrow, that low will start to slowly drift toward the east. Another piece of energy ejects out, along with some low overnight. So we're going to still see that convection in place, a little bit up around northern Nebraska. This may pivot more toward the northeast as the day progresses. And as we go into Monday, that low starts to open up and starts to move toward the east ever so slowly. Once again, a piece of energy is going to eject out of that in eastern portions of New Mexico. This is more going to take a more easterly route, so it looks like most of the precipitation on Monday is going to stay south of state, and very heavy moisture is likely to occur. As we get into Tuesday, as this low moves toward the Texas Panhandle and low pressure in south central Texas, it's going to be very close to the Gulf. We're going to see widespread heavy precipitation across the southern plains, particularly across Oklahoma and Texas, and I wouldn't be surprised we'll see some pretty active severe weather. Then on Wednesday, we start to draw that moisture toward the southeast of us. We're going to start to see a clearing trend across the southern part of the state. Most going to stay mostly dry across the northern part of the state as another upper air low moves into the western United States. So we will see some scattering of shower activity across the high mountain regions, but most of the primary activity will remain to our south. Now on Thursday, that low starts to move toward the northern plains, kind of get a zonal flow. Does show a surface low trying to develop in north central portions of the state. Not a lot of moisture to tap with, so we're going to be just looking at a scattering of precipitation as that main trough slowly works its way toward the east. And on Friday, that low tries to deepen, and we're going to try to send some energy into the western United States. But in the meantime, that's going to draw some fairly warm air toward the north. We're going to be staying fairly dry across most of the central part of the country as the primary convection still remains south of us in Texas. Now, as we go farther into the future, with that low pressure system coming in the Pacific Northwest, high pressure dominant across the northern plains, above normal temperatures looks to be the primary key going forward. And from next Thursday to the following Tuesday, the primary moisture will be to our south, but some of that may make it up, particularly late in the period, and we see some scattered precipitation across eastern Nebraska.
Thanks, Al. Finally today, last week, UNL professor and wheat growers presidential chair Stephen Baenziger retired from his position at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. In his time at this institution, Stephen secured invaluable funding from the USDA to further research efforts into the hybridization of wheat. The work Stephen leaves behind has been nothing short of revolutionary and will have an impact on the wheat industry for years to come. Market Journal's Bill Dodd was able to speak with Stephen before his departure to learn more about his research.
Wheat may very well be one of our most important production crops when it comes to feeding the world. Aside from giving consumers a large percentage of their daily intake needs, wheat is a sustainable and resilient crop for producers to grow.
Okay, well, wheat is important because currently 20% of the world's calories come from wheat, and 20% of all the protein that's consumed by humans comes from wheat. So it's 1/5 of your diet for your energy and 1/5 of your diet for protein. The other thing that's quite interesting about wheat is it's probably the original convenience food. If you think about it, nobody eats wheat kernels, at least most of us don't. They eat bread. And bread is prepared so you can buy it, eat it at almost any time. It's not like rice where you have to boil it. It's not like corn where you grind it and usually make it into a porridge or a tortilla. It's the original convenience food. Now, what makes it sustainable is that wheat is by far the most widely grown crop in the world. It can tolerate harsh winters. It can tolerate hot, dry springs and summers. So it's probably the most climate resilient cereal of all the staple crops. So it becomes the one that you really have to rely on.
As the world's population continues to grow, we'll inevitably have more mouths to feed. The hybridization of wheat varieties will be beneficial to producers as well as the wheat industry as a whole. Stephen has hopes that his research will help lead private industry and producers to increased profitability.
If you have hybrid wheat, it will also help private industry come back into the market. And with hybrids, they will have the investments because of the increased profitability to the companies as well as to the growers to basically replicate what happened in the corn industry. And we think that level of private investment coupled with public investment will be very good for both the economic well-being of the state and the country, as well as for the economic well-being of the producer and for the research that needs to be done. We think if we're successful with our hybrid wheats, we have the opportunity to revolutionize wheat production as well as wheat profitability and global food supply. The idea behind this is that seed will have to be purchased annually for growers. And in order for a grower to buy that seed, they basically have to make $2 for every dollar they invest. So the seed will be more expensive than the conventional seed, and it'll probably be, say, like $3 more, say something, probably more than that actually. But for every dollar they spend, the grower has to get at least $2 back in increased profitability. So we think that'll help with the profitability. It'll also help with the productivity because, right now the rate of gain is what we call it in the Great Plains is about 0.9%. Somewhere between 0.6, 0.9%, and we have to be at 1.4 to 1.7. And if we're not at 1.4 to 1.7 and we're doing the status quo, that's a plan to fail. And failure in agriculture means starvation, and we don't intend to let that happen.
Aside from a growing population to feed, climate change and other weather-related phenomena can pose a threat to many production crops. Through hybrid development, though, Stephen is hopeful this research could yield much higher climate resiliency as things progress.
Okay, well, so the first one is, of course, increased yield because we have to get that rate of gain up higher. The other thing which people don't often recognize is that an inbred line of wheat is or can be harmed by fluctuating weather. And hybrids tend to do much better in fluctuating circumstances. So when we were doing our hybrid trials, and this is without any knowledge of heterosis or anything else hybrid vigor, at most of our locations, out of our 700 hybrids, maybe 10 to 20 were better than the best pure line. But we had drought at North Platte, and then 200 out of 700 randomly made hybrids were superior. And so one of the things that hybrids will do is we think they'll build in a climate resiliency that we had not seen. So not only should growers be getting greater productivity, they should also be getting less risk. And that'll be true for the millers and the bakers also, because a hybrid will be more of an average of the parents of the hybrids. And so that'll mean that there's less environmental fluctuations on the milling and baking quality of the lines also if we're able to produce hybrids.
As people grab loaves of bread daily from grocery stores around the globe, it's easy to take that kind of convenience for granted. However, it all begins with people like Stephen taking the time to better understand crops like wheat in order to give everyone from producers to consumers the biggest bang for their buck.
Well, what I always like people to remember is that if you're familiar with the prayer, "Give us this day our daily bread," I'd like people to recognize that there's a team of researchers at the University of Nebraska in collaboration with our colleagues at the USDA Agricultural Research Service that work on answering that prayer 24/7, 365 days a year.
While Stephen may be hanging up his hat at the University of Nebraska, the research he helped pioneer over his career will continue to grow and evolve with other researchers. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Bill Dodd.
Thanks for that, Bill, and congratulations to Stephen on an outstanding career here at UNL. And on a personal note, always game for a Market Journal interview with Stephen. That was much appreciated on this end. If you'd like more information on Stephen's work over his time here at UNL, we've posted some links on the Market Journal website. That's going to do it for this week's show. If you missed a story, be sure to download the Market Journal mobile app, or you can follow us on social media to join in on the conversation. Next week, we'll examine how the Beef Quality Assurance Program benefits the beef industry and how you can become BQA certified. Plus, Frayne Olson will be here to answer your questions about the markets. Hope to see you right back here next time. I'm Troy Moling. Thanks for watching.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.